All right, let's get straight to it. A creature that vanished 13,000 years ago is supposedly back among us.
Mm-hmm.
That's the headline. Coming from Colossal Biosciences, claiming the resurrection of the dire wolf through, well, genetic engineering.
It's a pretty bold claim, yeah. And it fits right in with Colossal Biosciences' other ambitions.
Right. They're not just focused on the dire wolf
No, not at all. You might remember they're also targeting the Tasmanian tiger from Australia, gone since the early 1900s.
and the dodo bird.
The dodo, yeah, vanished from Mauritius way back in the 1600s. And, of course, the woolly mammoth.
That classic Ice Age elephant relative.
Yeah,
Extinct for what, 4,000 years?
about that, yes. So they have this big roster of de-extinction targets.
But the dire wolf, this is the one they're presenting as, like, their first success.
That's the narrative, yes. They've introduced these pups, Romulus and Remus, and then a female, Khaleesi.
Okay, the names Romulus and Remus and Khaleesi, that definitely screams Game of Thrones.
It does. It's a pretty savvy way to get people's attention using that pop culture connection.
Absolutely. Leveraging something people already know and are fascinated by.
And, that existing fascination, mostly from fiction, really fuels the public interest here.
But it hasn't all been positive press, has it? There's quite a bit of skepticism.
Oh, definitely. A lot of scientists are saying, hold on, is this really a dire wolf, or is it more like a gray wolf that's been tweaked,
Yeah.
genetically engineered?
Right. So that's really what we want to dig into today. Our mission for this deep dive is to understand, how they tried this, what the science actually says.
Exactly. And maybe start with what we knew about the dire wolf before all this.
Good idea. Where did this story begin, scientifically speaking?
Well, the earliest fossils turned up back in 1854 near the Ohio River.
Right.
Then, just a few years later, 1858, an American scientist, Joseph Leidy, he looked at them and classified them within the Canis genus.
Canis, so like dogs and rolls.
Exactly. Dogs, wolves, jackals, all those dog-like animals. He named it Canis dirus, basically, dire dog.
And for a long time, that was kind of the accepted view, right? That they were close cousins to gray wolves.
Pretty much, yeah. For about a century, that was the dominant thinking.
But there was some early debate.
There was. In 1918, another scientist, John Merriam, was studying all those amazing fossils from the La Brea tar pits in L.A.
Oh yeah, incredible finds there.
Right. And Merriam argued they were different enough to maybe be their own genus, separate from Canis. But that idea didn't really catch on at the time.
So it took a while for that idea to gain traction. It shows you how science works. Ideas get challenged.
Exactly. Accepted wisdom can change with new evidence. And that's just what happened much more recently.
Okay.
A big study came out in 2021, published in Nature, and it really shook things up.
How so?
It used genetic evidence and showed that dire wolves actually split off from the lineage, leading to gray wolves and other canids much, much earlier.
Earlier than people thought.
Way earlier, around 5.7 million years ago. That puts them on a really different evolutionary branch.
Wow, 5.7 million years. That's
Wow.
significant.
It completely changes the picture. They weren't just slightly different gray wolves. They were a distinct lineage that evolved in North America for a very long time.
And the study also found they lived alongside gray wolves.
Yes, for tens of thousands of years, dire wolves, gray wolves, and coyotes all shared the same territory in North America.
But they didn't.
Mix.
Apparently not. The genetic evidence showed basically no interbreeding, no gene flow between dire wolves and gray wolves or coyotes. They remained separate.
Which is really interesting because it leads to the question, why did the dire wolves die out around 13,000 years ago, but the gray wolves made it?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? The exact cause is still debated.
But there are theories.
Two main ones, really. One is about their diet. Dire wolves seem to have specialized in hunting megafauna, those huge Ice Age animals like giant sloths, horses, bison.
The ones that also went extinct around that time.
Precisely. So if your main food source disappears, that's obviously a massive problem for survival.
Makes perfect sense. Specialist predators are vulnerable. The other related idea focuses on that lack of interbreeding we mentioned. Gray wolves did interbreed with other canids, like dogs and coyotes.
Giving them more genetic diversity.
Possibly, yeah. That genetic flexibility might have helped gray wolves adapt better when the climate changed and the megafauna disappeared. Dire wolves, being more isolated genetically, might have lacked that adaptability.
Fascinating. Okay, let's talk about what they actually look like. Game of Thrones gives you this image of these massive, almost horse-sized wolves.
Yeah, the fiction definitely takes some liberties. In reality, they were bigger than modern gray wolves, but not astronomically so.
How much bigger?
About 25% larger on average. So noticeably bigger, stockier build, but not quite the monsters of fantasy.
Still formidable, though. Any other key differences?
Yeah, their heads were distinct, longer and wider than a gray wolf's head, and evidence suggests they had much more powerful jaw muscles.
For a stronger bite, taking down that large prey.
Exactly. Probably gave them a bone-crushing bite. And some fossil evidence, combined with the genetic hints, suggests they might have had lighter fur, maybe whitish or reddish blonde.
And did they hunt alone, or?
The consensus, based on fossil finds like multiple individuals caught together in the tar pits, is that they were social animals. They likely lived and hunted in packs, much like modern wolves do. It makes sense for tackling large, difficult prey.
Okay, so that's the dire wolf itself. Now let's get to the core of the de-extinction attempt by Colossal. You mentioned genetic engineering, but maybe we should quickly touch on the other ways people talk about bringing species back.
Sure. There are broadly three main techniques discussed for de-extinction. The first one is called backbreeding.
Backbreeding. Sounds like going backwards.
In a way, yes. You take living relatives of the extinct species that still show some of its characteristic traits. Then you selectively breed them, generation after generation, trying to emphasize those specific traits.
So you're kind of trying to recreate the look of the extinct animal through selective breeding.
Exactly. You're aiming for the phenotype, the physical appearance.
Is there an example of this being tried?
Yeah, the quagga project in South Africa is probably the best known one. The quagga was this amazing relative of the zebra.
Right, striped on the front, plain brown on the back.
That's the one. It went extinct in the 1880s, mainly due to hunting. The project started in 1987, taking plains zebras that had fewer stripes on their hindquarters and legs.
And breeding them together.
Yep, selectively breeding those individuals over many generations. And they have produced animals now that look remarkably like the old photos and skins of quaggas. They call them raw quaggas.
Wow. So it can work, visually at least.
Visually, yes. But the big caveat with backbreeding is that while it might look like the extinct animal, it doesn't have the exact same genes. You might be missing other traits, maybe behavioral ones or disease resistance, things we don't even know were lost. It's an approximation.
An approximation, not a true genetic resurrection. Okay, what's method number 2?
Method 2 is cloning. True cloning.
Like Dolly the sheep.
Exactly like Dolly. This aims to create a genetically identical copy of the extinct animal, but it requires something very specific.
Viable cells, right.
Right.
Preserved cells with intact DNA.
Precisely. You need a preserved cell nucleus from the extinct species. You take that nucleus and put it into an egg cell from a closely related living species after removing the egg's original nucleus.
That sounds incredibly delicate.
It is extremely difficult. It's been tried for de-extinction, most famously with the bucardo or Pyrenean ibex.
A type of mountain goat?
Yes, a Spanish mountain goat. The very last one died in 2000, but scientists had managed to freeze some skin cells just before that.
So they had the genetic material. Did it work?
Well, they tried. They put bucardo nuclei into hundreds of goat eggs. They got a few pregnancies and surrogate mothers, and amazingly, one clone was actually born in 2003.
It worked.
For a few minutes. Sadly, the cloned bucardo had severe physical defects, particularly in its lungs, and died very quickly.
What?
It highlights just how hard cloning is, especially with potentially damaged DNA from frozen cells. Success rates are incredibly low, and health problems are common.
A tough reality check.
Yeah.
Okay, so that brings us to the third method, the one Colossal used for the dire wolf. Genetic engineering. How's this different from cloning?
It's quite different. Instead of making an identical copy, genetic engineering involves editing the genome of a living relative.
Editing.
First, you need DNA from the extinct species, usually recovered from fossils. It's almost always fragmented and incomplete.
Okay.
Then you compare that ancient DNA sequence to the full genome of the closest living relative, in this case, the gray wolf. You identify the key genetic differences that likely accounted for the extinct animal's unique traits.
The bits that made a dire wolf, not a gray wolf.
Exactly. Then you use gene editing tools, like CRISPR, to go into the living relative's cells and change its DNA sequence at those specific points, making it match the extinct species sequence.
So you're rewriting parts of the gray wolf's DNA to be more like the dire wolf's.
That's the core idea. Once you have those edited cells, you use a process similar to cloning, inserting the nucleus of an edited cell into an enucleated egg cell to try and create an embryo.
And the challenge is there.
Two huge ones. First, Getting enough good quality ancient DNA is really hard. Fossils don't preserve DNA perfectly. Second, you often need to make potentially thousands of precise edits across the genome, not just a handful, to truly capture the essence of the extinct species. And doing that accurately is still a major technical hurdle.
Right. So Colossal Biosciences, founded in 2021, relatively new company.
Yes, founded by tech entrepreneur Ben Lamb and the well-known geneticist George Church. De-extinction is their explicit goal.
When we mentioned the mammoth, the Tassie tiger, the dodo, those are big, complex projects.
They really are. Each one has unique biological challenges. Think about the mammoth elephants have a nearly 2-year gestation period. That's a huge practical challenge for surrogacy.
And the Tasmanian tiger was a marsupial.
Right, so you need to figure out the pouch development aspect. And the dodo, being a bird, means dealing with eggs and avian reproductive biology, which is a whole different ballgame for genetic engineering and cloning techniques.
So given all that, why pivot to the dire wolf? Was it seen as maybe an easier test case?
That might be part of it, but a big factor apparently discussed in a 2023 meeting was the sheer name recognition.
The Game of Thrones effect again.
Exactly. Dire wolves are famous in pop culture, not just Thrones, but World of Warcraft, Dungeons and Dragons. They have this built-in audience and intrigue. It offered a lot of potential publicity.
A strategic choice then. And work started pretty quickly.
Seemed to. They reportedly began the actual lab work in the summer of 2023.
Okay, so first step, getting the dire wolf DNA. Where did they get it?
They highlighted 2 key samples. One was a tooth, about 13,000 years old, from a place called Sheridan Cave in Ohio.
Okay.
The other was even older, a skull, maybe 70,000 years old, found in the American Falls Reservoir in Idaho.
70,000 years. That's ancient. How much DNA could they actually get?
Colossal claimed they got vastly more data than previous efforts, like 500 times more sequence information. But they haven't publicly stated what percentage of the entire dire wolf genome that actually represents.
So we don't know if it's 10% or 50% or...
We don't. It's likely still incomplete, maybe quite fragmented, but apparently enough for them to feel they could move forward with the comparison.
Comparison to the gray wolf.
Yes. They compared the dire wolf sequences they had to the gray wolf genome, which they confirmed is the closest living relative. And they found that very high similarity, about 99.5% identical DNA.
Which sounds incredibly close. But that 0.5%, that's where the differences lie.
That's the crucial part. They had to figure out within that 0.5% which specific genetic changes were responsible for making a dire wolf look and function differently from a gray wolf.
How many genes did they end up targeting?
They selected 14 specific genes to modify in the gray wolf cells. The focus seems to have been mainly on genes controlling external features, things like overall body size, the shape of the head, maybe fur characteristics.
And they used CRISPR to make these changes.
That's right, CRISPR-Cas9. It acts like molecular scissors guided to precise spots in the DNA. You can use it to cut the DNA and either disable a gene or, more relevant here, provide a template for the cell to repair the cut using the desired sequence, in this case, the dire wolf version.
The technology that won the Nobel Prize.
Exactly. Emmanuelle Charpentier and Jennifer Doudna got the 2020 Nobel in chemistry for developing it. Colossal stated they made about 20 specific genetic alterations across those 14 target genes in gray wolf cells.
20 changes in 14 genes. And then they grew lots of these edited cells.
Thousands of them reportedly cultured in the lab.
So you've got these lab-grown cells with gray wolf DNA, but with specific dire wolf edits. How do you get from a dish of cells to, well, Romulus and Remus?
That's where the cloning-like process comes back in. Mid-2024, they took the nuclei out of these edited gray wolf cells.
The nuclei containing the modified DNA.
Yes, and they inserted those nuclei into dog egg cells that had had their own nuclei removed.
Why dog eggs, not wolf eggs?
Likely for practical reasons availability, established protocols for working with dog reproduction. So dog eggs essentially acted as the incubator for the edited wolf DNA.
Okay, makes sense.
They created 45 of these embryos and transferred them into 2 surrogate mother dogs.
And then waited.
Right. On October 1st, 2024, they performed C-sections. There were concerns, apparently, that the pups might be larger than normal dog pups, potentially causing complications.
And that's when Romulus and Remus were born.
The 2 males, yes. And since they came from the same batch of edited cells, they have the exact same modified DNA. They're essentially clones of each other.
Which is interesting because I read they already show different personalities.
That's right. Remus is apparently the bolder one, Romulus more shy. It's a great example of how genetics isn't everything.
Nature versus nurture. Or maybe gene expression.
Exactly. Even with identical genes, the environment they experience, random variations in development, how genes are switched on or off epigenetics, it all contributes to making them individuals.
Fascinating. And the third pup, Khaleesi.
She arrives later, born January 30th, 2025, using the same process. A female this time.
So Colossal says, mission accomplished, basically. Dire Wolf reborn. But what happens to these animals now? Are they going to be released?
No, definitely not. Colossal's been quite clear about that. These three, plus the maybe 3 to 5 more they plan to create, will not be allowed to breed.
No breeding.
No. They'll be kept in a secure enclosure, supposedly with high fences, drone surveillance. Sounds very controlled. Access will be limited, perhaps mainly for wealthy donors or specific visitors.
That immediately raises some big questions, doesn't it? Ethically, ecologically.
Huge questions. I mean, first, think about it from the animal's perspective. They're raised by humans, or at least dogs, in a completely artificial setting with no dire wolf parents, no natural pack structure. It's nothing like how their extinct counterparts lived.
Can they even thrive like that? Could they become like a species that exists only in captivity and then just disappears again?
That's a real concern. The idea of a twice extinct species. If they can't survive independently or reproduce naturally, what have you really achieved?
And it makes you ask about the purpose. Is the goal really ecological restoration, or is it something else? Scientific curiosity, publicity, maybe even profit down the line.
That's the debate surrounding a lot of de-extinction projects. What's the why? Ecologically, for the dire wolf, their main role was hunting large animals that aren't here anymore.
Right, the megafauna.
So if you did somehow reintroduce them today, what would they eat? They'd likely compete directly with existing predators like gray wolves for deer, elk, etc. Could that actually disrupt the current ecosystem? It's possible they could face similar pressures that led to their original extinction. Is there even a vacant ecological niche for them now?
It's a serious ecological gamble, and it also brings us back to the question of authenticity. Are these really dire wolves?
That's probably the most fundamental scientific critique. They're gray wolves that have had maybe 20 specific DNA letters changed across 14 genes.
Out of billions of DNA letters in the entire genome.
Exactly. It's a tiny, tiny fraction of the total genetic makeup. Remember, gray wolves and dire wolves were already 99.5% similar. These engineered animals are also 99.5% similar to extinct dire wolves, but they achieved that tiny difference via editing, not millions of years of separate evolution.
So it's like if you changed a few genes in a chimp to make it look a bit more human, it wouldn't actually be human.
That's a good analogy. Humans and chimps share about 98.8% of their DNA. Changing a handful of genes wouldn't bridge that gap in any meaningful biological sense beyond appearance. So calling these dire wolves is debatable. They are genetically engineered wolves designed to resemble dire wolves.
Which then leads to the really big picture question, resource allocation. Is this the best use of scientific effort and funding?
Many conservationists argue quite strongly that it isn't. They say we have thousands of species critically endangered right now, species that have existing roles in today's ecosystems.
Like the northern white rhino.
A tragic example. Down from maybe 500 in the 1970s to just 2 non-reproductive females today. They are functionally extinct, and people are discussing using advanced reproductive technologies, maybe even genetic techniques, to try and save them from complete oblivion. But the focus there is on a species that was part of the modern ecosystem very recently.
So the argument is, shouldn't we focus on preventing extinctions in the first place? Protecting habitats, tackling poaching, climate change.
That's the core argument. Prevention is better than a highly uncertain, incredibly expensive, and ethically complex cure like de-extinction, especially when you consider the scale of the problem. That UN report from 2019 warned over 1 million species are at risk.
1 million species.
It puts projects like this into perspective. While the science is undeniably impressive, the question is whether it's the right priority.
So it's a fascinating scientific achievement, no doubt about that. Creating these animals took incredible skill.
Absolutely. Pushing the boundaries of genetic engineering.
But it opens up this huge container of ethical questions, ecological uncertainties, and debates about what conservation should even mean in the 21st century.
It really does.
Which leaves us, and you the listener, with a final thought to chew on. Given all these complexities, the cost, the ethical dilemmas, the ecological unknowns, the question of authenticity, where should we really be putting our energy and resources when it comes to the biodiversity crisis? Is trying to resurrect ghosts of the past the answer? Or should our focus be squarely on protecting the life that's here with us now and securing its future?
It's a critical question for all of us as we navigate these powerful new technologies.